Welcome to the next episode of UC Buyer TV. Joined today by Chrysantos Ibrahim, one of the co-founders of Prodoscore, a company that's been absolutely lighting it up in the employee productivity software space. And purpose of our call today here is to talk about, you've heard a lot with the coronavirus and ominous warnings from the CDC last week, ever-changing news every day. And how it relates to the technologies, implications for a mass remote work scenario are certainly something that every enterprise should be planning for today. And technology that's advanced to the point where it enables workers to effectively do what they do at the office, from home, or for that matter, anywhere. So,
you know, sometimes it's not just inconvenient to come into an office. Sometimes it's dangerous to come into an office because people get sick in those offices. I mean, the reality of it was in Denver at Simple Signal, every winter we went through this thing where we put the Purell out in the common areas because everybody was making each other sick. You know, they sneeze into their hand and they go open the door and the next guy grabs the door and it ultimately ends up sick. Not only that, but even in the HVAC, stuff gets sucked into that whole thing, right, and spread out across the building. So the building itself is sick and stays sick for all of the winter. Let's call it 5-6 months. We fought employee absenteeism. And it was all because we couldn't control these germs. Secondarily, a lot of cities are creating a hazardous workplace because people trying to get into their offices are accosted by the homeless population. And we have this problem in San Francisco. It's radically an issue. So, you know, Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles, San Diego all have big populations of homeless. And that is a threat to the worker trying to get to work also. So let's just find a way to use our communications better so that people don't always have to take on a hazardous job in order to accomplish their work.
Well, you bring up a good point, Dave, that I hadn't thought about until before you joined. Chrysantos and I were talking about, because past lives have, obviously gotten to know a lot about liability issues for companies. And we were talking about how our upcoming conference in Vegas, some of the big providers are backing out. And so for exactly the reasons you talked about, this is also going to become a big liability issue for companies, because if you knowingly send your workers into a what potentially is a threatening environment, in this case, a highly contagious
biohazard,
disease, then a risk that companies run if they don't have plans in place and they don't execute fast enough, and somebody gets sick, God forbid somebody gets sick and family sues the company, there's liability issues here. So, obviously I'm no expert on that other than the fact that knowing what they are, if I'm a corporate officer, and making sure that we're doing all the right steps. But boy, if I'm a corporate officer today, and I do sit on a board where we have oversight, these are things that we're talking about. So, and one of the big inhibitors to going down that path is the fear of the unknown. It's the fear of not having a plan in place. So therefore, that's exactly why, companies, in my humble opinion, have to be looking at this now, even if this thing is overhyped, overblown, settles down. At some point, what we're talking about here is going to likely come in play, whether it's widespread cybersecurity attack or other emergencies, disaster scenarios. We're going to talk about that today. So first question to you, Chrysantos. What are your thoughts on the news that you've seen? And if you are a CIO of a company that's, let's say, got 1,000 employees, what types of things are you thinking about right now?
So again, thanks for having me, Mike and Dave. Really excited to be here, first of all. So thanks for having me.
We love having you, man.
I think at the end of the day, if I'm a CIO, I bet you anything, they just accelerated the whole process of like, okay, how are we going to move our PBX to the cloud? How are we going to move our Exchange server to the cloud? How are we going to, get rid of these VPN server access, which we all know is, a lot of people don't use them anymore. So I think that's the first thing that people are probably thinking about is, how do I enable the remote workforce? If people aren't going to come into the office.
Right.
Yeah, I think the bigger part of this is that people who have held back in the technology are finding themselves kind of in a helpless situation because people can't come to work. Sometimes because of even things like quarantines. I mean, this is getting to be crazy worldwide, and it's only a matter of time until something like this, if it's not coronavirus, it can be something else that could cripple a business in terms of its productivity. So today, I kind of like to talk about what it is that businesses can do, whether they're in the cloud or not. If they're not, they need to quickly get to the cloud because it's the only way to tie all of the pieces of your communication together. And
Right.
so if they are that way, then what are the pieces that are still left unaddressed that keeps their workforce productivity wise together? And I think that part of that is to think in terms of how to measure people's working when they're working from home as well. And that's really why I'm excited Sonos has joined us for that part of the conversation. But maybe we start with the idea of what does a business need in its raw form to be able to continue business as usual in spite of the fact that they can't go into the office?
Well, you bring up an interesting point, Dave. So maybe it makes sense to break this conversation down into two components.
Yeah.
What are the what if scenarios if you're already in the cloud? Because I would argue, and I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on this, but I would argue that even if you're in the cloud already, right? And you've got workers that are accustomed to showing up at the office every day and performing their work in an office setting, that even in that scenario, you've got to plan and prepare because most of those workers, if let's say they're using a unified communications platform, most of those workers probably don't have all the mobile features enabled, right? They probably aren't using the mobility app that's on the mobile phone. They probably don't take their device home, plug it in, and do work from home. They probably don't use the instant message, presence, chat, desktop sharing, collaboration tools because most of their work's performed in an office. When they have meetings, they have a meeting physically in an office. When they need some help from one of their peers, they walk around the corner. Now, granted, there's an increasing number of remote workers today compared to, let's say, 5-10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I don't think anybody should take it for granted that you're already in the cloud because shifting from showing up to an office every day and performing your work to now having to do it at home, I think that's a big challenge for even the companies that move. So what do you guys think on that topic? In terms of what you should be doing if you're already in the cloud, but you've got workers that aren't using the tools and you don't have visibility into what they're doing.
So Mike, you brought up a very good point. And a while ago, you guys all know who John Arnold is, right?
Yep.
Absolutely. The analyst. So I hired him and to go do a consulting gig for me, and I wanted him to find one number for me. And this was so important because I needed somebody who was a trustworthy source. I wanted him to tell me what was the actual adoption rate of the mobile application from the UC side. And he gave me a full report. I have the report. I'd be more than happy to share it with you guys.
I'm going to guess 20%. I'm going to guess 20%.
He said 10%. He said less than 10% adoption rate.
Yep.
And so basically people aren't even using the mobile application. They don't have it set up right, or they're just using their personal cell phone, right? And and that's kind of the story of UC, is it, and I've even been into some offices where I still see the phones in the boxes. They haven't even taken them out.
Yeah.
So that's why you see the shift to contact center, because obviously with contact center you can see all the adoption, you can see the use cases. However, I will go back to this point. As we start moving people to a remote workforce, what is the number one thing that has prevented people, or CEOs like Dave, deploying remote workforces and allowing people to work remotely, is the trust. Trust is the biggest factor. That there are still a lot of bosses, if you think about it, the baby boomers, they still control majority of the businesses in America. They still control, the revenue for most businesses in America. And they grew up in a completely different mindset, right? They want that office. They want you in that office. right? So now all of a sudden you're telling them, hey, the employees need to go work from home. Oh my God, what goes in their mind? They're like thinking, oh, he's watching ESPN all day. He's drinking coffee. He's looking at the birds. He's doing grocery runs. He's picking up his kids. So the panic sets in, like, I'm paying all this money for this workforce, and they're not even working.
And do you think what do you think the driving factor is behind that? Is it because I got some certain theories that certain people just don't have the DNA to work from home and need to be in a very structured environment. Some folks, I think it's the video. Let's take video as a prime example. Today I use the hell out of it, but there's been tons of studies about video adoption, right? And what got me really drinking the Kool-Aid is having the right equipment in place. So a good set of headphones, a good speaker, a application like we're using today, Zoom, that allows you to feel like you're almost in the same room with somebody. And then you've got companies like Poly introducing some new equipment. So part of it's just the immersive experience to replicate being in the same room with somebody. But what else do you think is holding companies back from, and what do you think the biggest challenges are going to be in a remote work scenario to try to keep people engaged, productive, and contributing? Because that's the big fear I have is, what's this do to the economy if companies can't manage it and all of a sudden you have a 50% drop off in productivity?
So some of the data we've already seen, we do see some employees who they should not be working from home, right? I mean, they're just not disciplined. So
and how do you tell that?
Or they don't have a good place to work, right? They're trying to do it from the kitchen table. They need to have their own private space inside of their home, and a lot of people just don't have that. So that is challenging.
You're right. I mean, so we can see the trend lines. So we have like this thing that's kind of like a heartbeat. And we have seen that when some employees who are working from home, their productivity drops. But we've also seen the inverse. We've seen that when employees are working from home, their productivity shoots through the roof. But when they're in the office, the productivity drops. And you can contribute that to a lot of conversation, talking, walking around. Like I remember I used to go into the offices, and I never worked when I went into an office because all I did was socialize. I would just jump from cubicle to cubicle to office just to find somebody to talk to. I didn't do any work.
Or even if it's a good thing, just to walk over and start a conversation that's in some way collaborative, but it wasn't planned, is that thing that distracts you from really being able to hunker down and accomplish your work. So these kinds of things happen inside of office structures that really don't happen when you're working from home in an effective kind of way. But the other issue is accountability. I mean, forever, people have managed people butts in seats. If their butt was in the seat, they were working. Well, we know now through measuring stuff.
Productivity. That's not true. Just because you're in office does not mean you're working.
No, they're shopping, they're messing around on the internet, they're not working, necessarily knocking it out the way that we thought they were, right?
Right.
Some of what's on Prodoscore measures this.
So Chrysanthos, you bring up an interesting point because you now have you got a great application that you've built that has that gives enterprises the ability to see the analytics tied to employee productivity specific to applications they use, the work they perform. And I guess by now you've probably accumulated enough data. So have you been able to do data correlation when you mentioned that certain people shouldn't work from home, are there any attributes or characteristics that you've been able to identify that would be useful for your clients or potential clients to say, based on these factors, this person is likely to not be productive in an at-work or an at-home environment, and therefore they need to have, and therefore take that data and translate that into action?
So you bring up a good point. So we are in the middle, and I cannot say the name of a very large, well-known company, and they asked us to do something we had never thought about. So what they asked us to do was they said, hey, listen, we're interested in this product. Can you do us, we want to validate it. And we're like, okay. So they asked us to onboard and test, validate, I think about almost 2 years worth of data. They identified certain employees So these were employees who had been with them for like 2 years, and they didn't tell us why, but they just said, here's the 10 employees we want you to look at. So we pulled back their data, and then when we looked at their data, they wanted us to go into their first 90 days from when they worked, and they wanted us to say what was their score in their first 90 days of when they worked. And what they were able to do was create a baseline. So when they're hiring new employees, because they wanted to see if that correlated, because these guys have been here.
Absolutely. Yep.
So we can identify, and each company is its own, right? Like sometimes we don't even know everything, and we learn just as much from the companies who are trying to figure out ways to create baselines.
Sure.
To identify people and then basically replicate them, and as you and I talk, Mike, leading versus lagging indicators.
Yeah, I went through a similar thing back when I was at XO. We had roughly 500-person organization, different training programs in place before I took over the role, and we launched a new program that revolved around the Challenger sale. And one of the things that we did is we did these extensive profiles for our entire rep population, and we also correlated that to who were the top performing reps, overlaid the data. And the conclusion was that, sure enough, is for those that haven't read the Challenger book, must read if you're in sales or marketing. But the majority of our top performers were indeed Challenger profile. Then what we did is use that data to reshape how our managers interview people, and how we coached them and managed them. And I can see the same thing applying here. That if you see certain attributes, because if I've always got the belief that your first 90 days are going to shape. That's the foundation. And that's why it's so critical for companies to have a good onboarding program and really focus on training, coaching, development, and start with the interview process all the way to onboarding. And usually hire fast, you fire fast, because usually if you got concerns 90 days in, now you've got the data to back it up, which is massive. So back to the remote work scenario. How can tools like Prodoscore help companies that are now that they're not going to have that manager in the corners walking the floor and seeing what's going on? Now they're not going to have that luxury. So potentially. So how does software like yours help them solve that challenge?
Well, assuming that these companies have moved to the cloud with UCaaS, with CRM, with email collaboration, so assuming that is already in place, right? You are now able to access these APIs, and like I just had another story from another business leader where he would come in and he would ask the assistant to pull reports from the UCaaS system, from their phone system, pull the reports from Salesforce, pull the reports from their email. I think they were using G Suite. He would have 3 reports, and he would try to make sure everybody was working.
Yep.
And, you need something that can consolidate. And again, going back to trust. Trust is huge. And if we don't have trust, then what do we have?
Right. Exactly. So, in Chrysanthos, you've played in the peripheries of UC for many, many years. So, as you look at the market, and Dave and I talked about this yesterday, because I've seen stats anywhere from 30% market adoption up to 60%. And I think some of the variables are, based on a variety of factors, but nonetheless, there's still a huge, huge chunk of the market that's got prem-based UCaaS systems in place. They haven't moved their application to the cloud yet. So what advice would you give for somebody that's not ready and needs to be moving fast? And Dave,
so one of the
I'll welcome your feedback here too, because this is a big one for everybody's trying to figure out right now.
Yeah.
I mean, this is where the mobile side, this is why I had John Arnold look at that. It's like we need UC solutions that can be deployed on the mobile device that can layer in a business phone service, right? But we got to make sure that people are using it, right? And that's where scoring comes in. We've seen a huge correlation. We've seen 800% increase in adoption on one particular customer. Once we deployed Prodoscore, they weren't even using it. And all of a sudden now they're getting scored on the usage of their mobile UC. If they don't use it, they don't get credit.
So you're using it like you're almost gamifying the use of the app because they get points based on utilization. So therefore, it's the carrot instead of the stick. That if you use it, you're gonna move up the stack ranking. Is that the
Yep,
theory?
that's exactly.
Love it.
We actually weight UC higher. So like we have email, calendar, chat, CRM activity, phone activity. We actually weight UC because every time we talk to a business leader, we hear all the same thing. I wish they'd stop hiding behind email and pick up the phone because the phone still does work, right?
Amen.
The phone still works, right? And a lot of people are afraid of the phone. So we give more credence the more they use the phone. But if they're not using their business phone, we can't weight them. So they're penalized if they want to continue to use their personal cell phone. If they want to continue to use their personal cell out of habit, again, it's a habit, they use their personal cell phone, then they're just not going to get credit. And for the peers that actually use the business phone system, their weightage is going to go up, their scores are going to go up, and they're going to look better in front of their bosses.
I got an idea for you. Can you, a few years back when we had a problem with different functional groups within an organization I was working for at the time, playing this volleyball email, reply to all, which just solves nothing, right? So we put a rule in place that said, if you get to 3 replies, pick up the freaking phone. So I got an idea for you for all of your clients because this stuff drives me crazy when I see these volleyball emails. I saw one last week that literally had 25 replies. Put in place negative rules if a email thread gets past 4 replied also.
Yeah. So, you threw out the idea that there are still a lot of prem-based phones out there. We know that Avaya alone has more than 200 million phones worldwide that are not in any way cloud-based. So there's a huge amount of adoption that needs to happen before the world is really moved into the whole UC domain. But things like this coronavirus really forces that adoption because we realize now that when you tie together your cell phone with your desk phone, with all the ways that a business collaborates, when that all starts working together, wow, what an amazing opportunity for the worker because they can work effectively from anywhere. Even
a lot of
going on out there in the world and they can't get to work or are prevented to come to work because of the communicable disease or whatever it is. Today it's corona, but next year it'll be something else. So I think that businesses have to work hard at building their business continuity strategy. We're starting to see a ton of articles this week come out, like in HBR, for instance. They're talking a lot about how businesses need to change to a form of unified communications. It's amazing what's really going on right now.
Yeah, and the unfortunate thing, Dave, is most companies aren't going to know how strong their business continuity disaster recovery plan is.
Yep.
Until they actually have to run it. And it's amazing to me. I actually had a meeting with a very, very large company a few years ago, met with the CIO. My VP asked the question, what's your business continuity disaster recovery plan? He opened up his drawer and said, this is my plan. And it was a resignation letter. And so I think this is going to test. A few years back, I was leading sales at a company that had a huge base of customers in New York City. And as much as people talked about, they had the plans, they'd moved to the cloud. When Hurricane Sandy hit a few years back, roughly 30-40% of our customer base was down hard for 2+ weeks. Of those, 30 to 40% of them never came back. They didn't survive because they didn't have enough cash flow to weather that storm.
Yeah.
And for the 6 months following, it was mass adoption. It's probably one of the best sales quarters that the New York City branch had because everybody scrambled. I think the same thing will happen here with UCaaS this year because of this. It'll be a wake-up call for those not prepared. It'll be a huge wake-up call. But what advice would you give to somebody that hasn't moved they're sitting on a prem, they got a prem-based system in place today. There are options. I mean, you can put in place tools very, very quickly. So let's talk about that for a minute.
So one of the experiences that I've seen, like in a situation that we are in now, obviously you're not going to have time to plan, right? So if I'm a CEO and I'm saying, hey, we need to move our email system or our phone system, you can set the systems up in parallel where they're basically running. Right. So they're running underneath each other. You still have your primary, but you can set it up to build out these parallel systems to give access to email so they can work from home, or the phone system, use the mobile, create the forwarding. And they're, if that's where you're caught right now and that's what's happening to you, then that's your only option, and then go online, create an online CRM account with either Zoho or Salesforce or whatever you're going to use, right?
Right.
To give access to the contact management. Then once everything settles and you're able to get into that position, then you can start moving everything, and I think companies, the worst position, I think companies still have a lot of on-premise stuff because that's the painful stuff that nobody wants to move because it's boring and they don't see the value. So they don't do it unless they have to.
Yeah. And I tell you, it's speaking of UC, I think, I talked to a lot of companies that just perceive that the move is a lot more difficult than it has to be, because you're right, Crisantos. You can actually stand up a system literally. I mean, we my last company, we would, in emergency situations, we get an entire system up inside of 24 hours. And there's other tools like the one we're using today that literally setting up a Zoom account, if you're an individual, takes you 5 minutes. If you want to set that up for an organization, probably takes you a little bit longer to get the settings set up and get all the users set up properly. But there are options out there. And let's talk about employee productivity software. How long does it take you to set up a client?
15 minutes. You can install it yourself as long as you're the admin of the 365 or the Google Apps admin. I mean, you can deploy this so quickly. I mean, we spent a lot of time just making sure it was easy to deploy. Where we look at a lot of these other systems out there, they're complex. They're not very easy to deploy. Ours, we like to use the word Barney-proof. Remember that term? I don't know if you guys remember. We make it Barney-proof.
Barney Fife or Barney from
Barney the dinosaur, remember?
Yeah, absolutely. My kids were growing up during the heyday of that, so I think I've watched a whole bunch of episodes.
The point is, it doesn't have to be anything complex. It can really be a simple thing where you start thinking in terms of what to connect. Is that what you're saying, Chris Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, and I want to share this one last thing with you guys specifically. I was on a call yesterday with one of our biggest investors, and our big investor, and I told him, I said, look, the future, we had a kind of a lull where I feel like communications kind of just fell off the map, and now with remote working, because now we have to take in networking, we have to take in communications, video, like all of these things. Communication is going to come back in a whole new different type. And that's where we're going to start experiencing, machine learning, AI, call transcription, with APIs and having all these tools, because more and more people are going to work remotely, right? And communication is going to play a huge role all over again, where these past 10 years have kind of felt like a lull, but I feel like communication industry is going to come back in a huge, big way.
I agree. And if my kids who are 25 and 23 are in indication, as well as their friends, they're really revolting against traditional social media, and just because of the toxicity of it. And now, granted, they use tools like Snapchat, but I see the phone making a comeback, and both my kids would rather pick up the phone to solve a problem than trade emails or even chat back and forth. So I agree. And the immersion of some of the technology. Had a fascinating conversation with Polly last week where, they're starting to incorporate artificial intelligence into their conference devices and being able to pick up on attenuation and facial recognition to see if meetings are productive. They'll be able to, tell what's the optimal temperature in the room, and the same kind of criteria that you're tracking to dictate or to determine whether somebody's going to be productive or not. It's those leading indicators. And so you can put those in play across literally the whole productivity ecosystem to make people's lives better and more productive. And for those that... Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, Dave and Mike, next time we do one of these, we should have a call where we talk about when do you use a text message. Like, I usually only use text messages when it's somebody I don't even want to talk to, right? And then when do you use a phone call? Like, I use a phone call when it's something I want to have an intimate, very deep discussion, or I want to get something really quick. When do you use a conference call? When do you use a video call? Like, I don't want people to see what I look like. Sometimes I'm not even presentable. Like, when do you use these forms of communication? When is it optimal?
Well, that's interesting. That'd be a hell of a topic. Yeah, I agree. But that's probably a topic for another day, and you get the wheels turning, because my initial bias was personal, situational, but it's also what you know. So I think there's real opportunity there. Closing comments, Dave, and then I'll go to you, Chrysantos, on anything else you want to add for this discussion.
Well, I think that now is the time for business leaders to really sit down with their exec teams and think carefully about what can change immediately, what will take a little bit longer of a time frame to accomplish these things. But in general, it's think through your UC. And that's a little bit about why we have the UC buyer in the first place. People are coming in wondering, how do I tie all of these pieces together to create a uniformed communication strategy, like it was thought about on purpose. And so for those reasons, it just works. But now we're being forced, because of this crazy virus that is keeping people from work, we're being forced to do something about it immediately. So the fire is on, people. It's time for us to start thinking about this in more than just esoteric ways. Now it's about saving your business. Now it's about being effective like never before.
Well said. Chrysantos, closing comments, and boy, that's a tough close to top, but I'm sure you got it.
No, I think it is a very timely topic. I think a lot of businesses are not ready. And I think sometimes we don't want to do things like if it wasn't for the last minute, nothing would get done, right? And I think businesses are going to be forced to figure out, okay, what's our remote workforce strategy? Because most companies don't have one. I mean, it's not something that people want to talk about, because I'm paying $100,000 a year for office space, and you're telling me you don't want to come into my beautiful office? That doesn't make sense. So it's a very painful pill to swallow, that you don't want to come to my beautiful office. And now everyone's going to start working from home, and they have no way how they're going to manage that.
Good point. Well said. So if you like the topic, the discussion, subscribe below. And for more, we'll be recording interviews, assuming our conference is on next week in Las Vegas. We'll see all of you there. We'll be talking about this more if the conference is still on. And if not, stay tuned, because we've got a whole series of blog topics on this exact topic, where we're going to be talking about not only things we talked about today, but providing useful tools for IT leaders, like checklists and how-tos for those that need to scramble and need to make decisions fast. So thanks for tuning in. Appreciate your time, and stay tuned for more, folks.